Hey everybody, Pastor LeeWood here. I am going to be doing this video just to make sure that we are covering down on everything that we are planning on working through with our Sermon on the Mount series. And so if you're watching this or listening to this is actually a session that we're going to be doing in between weeks 5 and 6. That's why you see the title the way that it is. We are basically circling back around to deal with a topic that we just didn't have time to deal with last week. And so what we're going to be doing tonight and this time and in this session is we're going to be talking about oaths. This is that section that we were going to be talking about that we were not going to have time to address last week. So if you got any questions about what all we covered, go back and watch that. We'll get you taken care of there. What I want to do first is I want to give us a bit of a recap on where we have been recently here in Matthew chapter 5. And so what we need to see is in this section of Matthew 5 is whenever Jesus is going to be giving 6 examples of what it looks like to have this greater righteousness. We see that Jesus fulfilled all the requirements of the law in Matthew 5:17 through 20. And that's where Jesus says that he has not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And so he gives 6 examples of what that looks like now for us who are living in his kingdom as though it is here already. And this example that we're going to be looking at is the 4th one. So it's the second or second of 3 pairs of examples that we give, and divorce and oaths kind of go together for obvious reasons. And then we're going to talk about in verse 48 eventually where Jesus is going to call us all to this standard of perfection. That's where we've been recently. Got any questions, go back and listen to watch the previous sessions. You will be good to go. All right, so what I want to do is I want to give you the recap from last session. Is we talked about marriage, where Jesus was looking to anchor marriage in the ethic of the new community that he is going to be building. He is working towards this idea of the community of believers that he is going to be inaugurating in his kingdom. They're just going to view marriage differently. And if they're going to be viewing marriage differently, well, that necessarily brings us to the topic of what we're going to be talking about tonight, and which that is oaths. And so what it means to let your yes be yes and your no be no. And so that's what we're going to be talking about here. If you got any questions, you can go back and look at that. But I would just remind you that what we said at the very beginning of week 4 with our main idea there was that we are the ones as Christians who are to pursue redemptive living as we combat sin that we encounter in our life, including a lack of truthfulness, which is what we're talking about tonight. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to read the text for us, and then we will talk about everything that is going on here in the text. This is what Jesus says in Matthew 5:33 through 37. I'm going to be reading from the ESV. This is what he says. Again, you have heard that it is said from those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. And he's quoting from a couple of places there, most likely from Exodus chapter 20, verse 7, and Leviticus chapter 19, verse 12. We'll talk about that here in a bit. Verse 34, but I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is the footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. And let what you say simply be yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil, or your translation may even say, or from the evil one. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is a rather difficult thing that we need to wrap our heads around when it comes to what we're supposed to do when it comes to discussing oaths. And so before we get into the details of this, the main idea of everything we're going to be talking about here is that oaths are unnecessary for honest people. That's the main idea. What Jesus is getting at here in this example is that oaths and us swearing on something, particularly whether it is on heaven or on earth or on Jerusalem or on your own head or on my mama or my dead dad, whatever, like it doesn't matter what it is you're swearing on. Jesus is saying those things are unnecessary if you were just simply honest. Everything we're going to talk about is going to come back to that here in just a bit. And so what I want to do is I want to give us some relevant texts, and this is a whole list of them. So I'm just going to throw them out there for you and you can work through these, but I just want to kind of give you a little bit of an idea about what each of these are. So in Exodus chapter 20, verse 7, this is where we get the commandments from the first 10 commandments, right? The 10 commandments. And it says that you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. And then Leviticus 19:12 is expanding on that, where Moses says, you shall not swear by my name, talking about God, falsely, and so profane the name of God. I am the Lord. And so Leviticus 6:3-5, and then even 19:12, you're going to see a ton of overlap in a lot of these ideas. And then Deuteronomy as well. You'll see a bunch of that. But one of the big things is in Numbers chapter 30. That entire chapter is about taking oaths, and it gives some very specific areas in which we're supposed to do that. So I would encourage you to go read all of these texts, and basically our text here in Matthew 5, and then later we're going to look at another one. I didn't want to give the whole thing away. Whenever we look at the very end of Matthew in Matthew 26, spoiler, Jesus actually does exactly what he commands us to do. And so we're going to look at one very particular example of that here towards the end of the session. So write down all those texts, go look at them, hold them in your head, because I'm not actually going to hit every single one of them in nearly as much detail as we might think. Because what I want to do is I want to capture conceptually what it is that Jesus is actually working on here and what it is that he is addressing. Cool. All right. So here's the number one thing that I want us to see whenever we're talking about how we are supposed to be honest in all of our dealings. And that first bit is that we need to understand that oaths are binding. And what do I mean by oaths being binding? At the end of the day, it's what Jesus says there at the very end of Matthew 5:37. He says, just let your yes be yes and your no be no. Don't do anything else. Just have that be what you say you're going to be and do what you say you're going to do. He goes on to explain that if you do anything beyond that it's going to be dangerous. It's getting us into a bad situation where we start swearing on something else. And so let's just kind of run this to the ground. What are some of the things that we need to be really clear of? Well, at the end of the day, we are referencing Exodus chapter 20 and Leviticus 19, and we need to understand that what Moses is getting at there and what the Ten Commandments are driving at when it talks about taking God's name in vain is normally talking about how whenever we promise to do something either to God or we are invoking God's name, saying that I promise on God that I will do this, and then you don't do it. Well, that is a sin. That is you taking the Lord's name in vain. I know that a lot of people kind of think of taking the Lord's name as like cussing, and specifically, a very particular kind of cuss or curse that you are invoking either on somebody or just in general. And that is not at all what I think is in mind here. I think it is whenever we are invoking God's name as like some foundation of my truthfulness, and then you don't go do that thing, well, you're just dragging God's name into the mud with your lying is really what's going on there. And so that is prohibited just from the get-go. And so what Jesus is doing is he is calling those to mind. And remember, he has fulfilled all of the law of Moses. He has not abolished it. And so what he does is he says, hey, guys, this is really what we need to do. He actually gives us essentially what is a negative command and a positive command. And that negative command is essentially this: do not break your oaths. Whatever you promise that you're going to do, just do it. You don't got to swear on nothing. Just do it. That's the negative command. Don't break your oaths. Don't break your word. The positive command then would be fulfill your oaths. Do what you said you were going to do. There's no need to drag anything else into this. There's no reason for that. In fact, what you are doing is something that is difficult for us to really wrap our mind around in our world. But at the end of the day, I think it makes a lot of sense just at first glance. Jesus said it's unnecessary. Oaths are unnecessary for honest people. So what does he say? Well, keep your word and don't break your word. But there's one more thing that he actually adds in there, is that I think we need to understand that human sinfulness actually complicates all of this. I totally understand why we have gotten into a situation where people feel as though their word is not enough, right? That my man makes a commitment, whether it's a college student or a senior adult, and they feel like they need to verify their honesty with that. The reason why we feel that impulse is because we recognize we live in a world in which that is not the case for most of the time. We recognize that we live in a world where people routinely lie, routinely break their oaths, routinely do not do what they say they are going to do. And that's a problem, right? Human sinfulness complicates things. So what does Jesus do? He gives a negative command, do not break your oaths, a positive command of fulfill your oaths. But then he also gives us one more big shot, and this is what I really want us to see. Jesus actually prohibits all oath taking. I don't really know of how we read what Matthew says, what he records Jesus saying, and actually read it in any other way. What Jesus says there is, again, you've heard it said of those of old, don't swear falsely. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all. That word for at all is halos. It just means singularly, and it means completely. He's totalizing his command. He is saying that there is no corner in which you can hide that this is not going to affect you. And then later on at the very end, he says, let your yes be yes and no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Or another way to translate that is it drags you into a scenario where there might be evil done. It's lying. So oaths are binding, whether we recognize it or not. And what Jesus is saying is just be honest. That's all that's necessary in my kingdom. Let your yes and your no be all you need to say. That's all you got to say. I keep even saying, let your yes be yes and your no be no. That's actually quoting James 5:12, which is James expanding on this, but he gets that point directly from his brother Jesus right here. So that's the idea about oaths are binding. But then there's another element that I think this is kind of the odd thing for us to see that Jesus is addressing right off the bat, but it actually makes sense whenever we put it in our context. And it's this idea of like scaling honesty, that like we can become more honest if we start swearing upon something more or less important. Does that make sense? And so this is what he specifically cites there in Matthew 5:34-36. Jesus says, I say to you, don't take an oath at all by heaven, the throne, because it's the throne of God, or by earth, it's the footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the king. And don't take an oath on your head because you can't do anything about it. And so the idea here is that Jesus is in fact referencing 4 levels of swearing upon objects, upon heaven, upon earth, upon Jerusalem, and upon your own head. And I think what's actually going on here is that Jesus is addressing some common things that people would have tried to have done to try to make their word seem more trustworthy. And what Jesus is saying is just don't do that. It's unnecessary. If you're being honest, there's no reason to swear on heaven or earth or Jerusalem or your own head. And I think the reason that he does this is because we fail to recognize that because God's omnipresence, he is directly related to everything. His omnipresence means that if you were trying to scale how honest you're being by heaven as opposed to your own head, like you're assuming that God is not supreme over your physical head any more than he is in heaven. You see how that breaks down? Like if heaven is where God resides, that's his throne room. Well, let me step it down. Maybe I don't want to invoke that much. Let me just swear on earth. Nah, can't do that either because earth is actually his footstool. And you're missing the point, aren't you? Okay, well, what about Jerusalem? Maybe that's a lower level of necessary truthfulness on my end. And frankly, I might not get in as much trouble if I mess this up. Well, nope, you're in trouble there because that's the city of the king. That's where the Messiah is going to rule from, and he is going to enter there, and there a lot of his ministry is centered there. You're missing the point. Okay, well, what about my own head? Well, you can't even do anything about your own head anyway. I cannot grow more hair than I have presently. You can't make your hair turn white or black or anything. You've got no sovereignty in this area. And so when we try to add these layers, we have completely missed the point, because at the end of the day, what we are doing when we are swearing upon these things, it's actually betraying our true intent. And that's to obscure our trustworthiness. We're trying to either elevate improperly. Well, I'm really going to be honest with you, and I truly am going to do what I say because I swore on God. I really am going to do what I said I was going to do because I said on my dead mom, right, on my mother's grave, right? Whatever we want to insert as like our colloquial thing that we have in our present day, Jesus is saying it is unnecessary because what we are doing is we are intentionally, actively obscuring that I am going to be trustworthy. Or at a minimum, what we're doing is we're providing like, it wasn't, I didn't swear on God. So like, it isn't that big of a deal, right? If I don't do what I said I was going to do, you've missed the point. You're being called to be honest. Matthew 5:48 says that the call that Jesus is placing on all those that are in his kingdom is actually perfection. And what he says earlier in the chapter is that our righteousness has to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And there's no place for lying. And so I say scaling honesty, but like there's no such thing as scaling honesty. There is honesty and there is dishonesty, and that is all there is to it. And so what I want to do now is I want to hit some areas of some practical application. And this is, I admit, the most difficult part, and I am going to be doing all of this in a 20-minute video, and it is woefully insufficient. But I want to try to give us some context as to like how this applies to us today, because I think our minds might run to some really clear examples that we have in our life that is, frankly, it provides a whole lot of difficulty for us and actually makes this situation all the more important that we nail down well what Jesus is saying. So I want to give the first example of an area that we need to talk about in practical applications for a lot of people is oaths of enlistment. And what I'm talking about is that oath that guys take, whether they are enlisting in the Army or the Air Force, whatever. And the oath, I actually pulled it from a website, from the Army's website, and this is what it says. I, and then you fill in your name, do solemnly swear, and then it actually has in parentheses, or affirm. We'll get into that here in a bit. Swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I will bear truth, faith, and allegiance to the same, that I will obey the orders of the President and of the United States and of the orders of the officers appointed over me according to the regulations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So help me God. So this oath of enlistment, I think, is something that, one, obviously I have participated in. I mean, you can even look, and there's my boots right over here over my shoulder, and there's books that I have on my shelf that that annotate my time in the military. I mean, I'm looking at my tomahawk that's up here on the wall with my coins and my rank, and it's clearly part of who I am. Well, like, did I break what the Lord was commanding here in Matthew 5? Well, I would say that in many ways, the answer is no. And I think this is really important because at the end of the day, I'm not swearing on anything. I am not in any way invoking a higher help. The closest thing would be that last phrase of "so help me God." And the way that many Christians have understood that in history has been like, with God's help, I can do this, right? I'm not actually saying, I promise on God, in heaven, in Jerusalem, wherever. Like, I'm not invoking that level of oath in that regard. And even in the actual oath, there's a carve out for not swearing, but affirming. I am affirming this is what I'm going to do. We'll talk about that here in just a bit in our second example. But I think this is one of those areas of our lives that many people have run into, and we may not necessarily know what to do. Which brings me to my second most common one is legal settings. And what I'm talking about with legal settings is if somebody is being sworn in either as a juror, or as someone who is a witness who is taking the stand. And in many settings, we understand that people were to put their hand on a Bible and raise their right hand, and then they repeat some phrase. And it's normally something along the lines of like, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God, right? And that's kind of the common language that we use. But here again, we have the exact same issue as enlistment oaths. And let me just say it this way. There is no constitutional requirement that actually happen for someone to be able to take the stand. Just number one, that's not even there. And whenever we think about even in the highest office in the land, the office of president, historically, presidents have put their hand on a Bible, especially in recent history, but that's not actually always the case. I mean, I think of one really clear example of like Henry Kissinger, whenever he was sworn in as the Secretary of State, he actually had his hand on a Hebrew Bible. Okay. There have been Muslim office holders who have sworn on a Quran. There have been other atheists like Thomas Jefferson. Whenever he was sworn in multiple offices, he actually had his hand on a copy of common law or a book of the U.S. Constitution. And his oath was he's going to defend the Constitution. So number one, there actually is no constitutional requirement for any federal official to do exactly what we have in our mind is what is required. And in fact, in many places, there is a carve out for this exact text. There's a famous case of a group of Quakers who were in Pennsylvania in the 1950s and 60s that they refused to swear that they would be truthful, that they would say nothing but the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They actually went to that language of I affirm. And I think that's getting to the point. The exact same carve out that we see in the enlistment oath for the Army is the exact same carve out that we see here. And my point that I'm actually trying to make is that this is not, again, invoking something higher than myself that I'm swearing upon. And so I am not trying to make the case that there is this private and public divide. And the moment you step into a public setting, then you can't make any oaths, but privately you can make any oath you want. Like, no. I don't think that's what we're trying to say here either. But what I am trying to say is that these practical applications need to be narrowly defined. And at the end of the day, honesty is what we are driving at, and Jesus is requiring greater righteousness. Here's the third example, and this is the one that I think most people's minds run to, and that's these moral dilemmas that somebody might concoct. Let me give you the scenario here. If you are in 1939 Berlin and you have some Jews who are hiding in your basement that you are trying to keep from becoming victims of the Holocaust, and a Nazi comes up to your door and says, "Hey, are you hiding Jews here?" Do you have to say, "Actually, yep, you caught me"? Is that really what's being required of us? And let me give us some context here. Number one, remember, Jesus is talking primarily about oaths where you are invoking something higher in yourself, whether it's heaven, earth, Jerusalem, or your own head. Number one, that's not actually even being what's depicted in this scenario. Number two, that whole element about oaths is a reflection of our honesty. And so I get it. Like, this is where the rubber meets the road. If I am to be commanded to be completely honest, and oaths are unnecessary for honest people, like I'm submitting in this main idea, then how am I supposed to not just tell them, "Hey, yeah, I'm hiding Jews here"? How am I supposed to address this? I think that honesty in this scenario is a requirement that God demands of us, but also love of neighbor is one of them as well, which we will talk about next week. I think that whenever we have those competing or different kinds of levels of moral actions that are required of us, even from the Sermon on the Mount, I do think that there is a bit of a hierarchy here. And I do think that if we are going to be honest, and that is going to directly lead to someone's death, I think that there is a carve out there. I think that there are examples in Scripture of where someone is misled, either tactically in the military or on some battlefield, or whether there is deception through interpersonal connections. If you want examples, come talk with me. I do think that there are biblical examples of that. Now, the question becomes, is that descriptive? Is it just describing that is what happened? Or is it prescriptive? Is it prescribing this is how we ought to act in that scenario? My last thing that I would say about that is that every bit of this requires wisdom. It requires so much wisdom that it is difficult for us to wrap our heads around. But here's where I want to say this. I think our desire is to tone down Jesus's words. He says, "Don't take any oaths at all." Our desire is to tone that language down. But the moment we start toning it down, I think we're missing the point. Because I think the point that Jesus is trying to make is this radical kind of honesty that is going to be clear among the people of God in his new community, because we are pursuing this righteousness that exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, and that is actually in pursuant to perfection. I think this is going to require wisdom, but at the end of the day, I don't think we get to tone down Jesus's words, which brings me to what my final thoughts are. Let's work through those because I think we'll find some benefit here. Here's the first thing that I want to say as far as our final thoughts go. Jesus's prohibition of no oaths at all, it stretches us beyond what we think is possible. And frankly, for a lot of us, we even might push back and say, man, is that really necessary? Is me not swearing an oath, is it really necessary? Is that what Jesus is after? And here is my point. Yes, Jesus commands it. He expects it. He gives us that negative command. Don't fail to fulfill your oaths positively. Do what you say you're going to do. That's in part and pursuant to living out righteousness under the kingship and headship of Jesus. I don't really know any other way to get around that. For a lot of us, we might think that this is something that we cannot do. How am I ever going to actually operate in a legal setting? Well, I think you should have a conversation with somebody if you're going to get called to the stand and say, I don't think I need to swear on a Bible. I am affirming that I will be honest, and that is just the end of the matter. And if that means that you are not put on the stand, okay, well, then that's going to require some wisdom for us to have some conversation about that. But at the end of the day, I don't think that that is something that we need to get wrapped around the axle too much, because we are seeking to be obedient to our Lord and Savior. That's hard, but I think that's the truth. The second thing that I want to tell us is that an oath is an oath, whether or not you think God is involved. Here's what I mean by that. I think a lot of times that in our culture, we have this fear of missing out, especially folks who are millennials or Gen Z. We have a really hard time committing to doing anything. And part of the reason for that is because we fear that there might be something better that comes out on the other end. And I just didn't know about that option. And so I'm not going to commit too harsh now, because then if I want to change my mind later, I can't do it. And here's the point that I want to make. It doesn't matter if you want to be able to change your mind later. This is a primary issue of your honesty. If you make a commitment, be there, period. If you're not doing that, then you are unreliable, you are untrustworthy, and I think that that is going to have all sorts of other entailments, not just in your consistency with what you say you believe and how you actually live it out, but I think it actually goes beyond that into like a real character issue, which is what Jesus in many ways is addressing. Remember, this whole section that we have about Jesus fulfilling the law is preceded by the Beatitudes. It's preceded by a listing of characteristics that are expected of those who are going to be in the kingdom and how we're going to exemplify it. If we are unable to be honest and say, yes, I'll be there, and then actually show up, I don't know if we've actually heard what Jesus has told us about righteousness. I don't think we actually comprehend what he means when he says, you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. If you haven't gotten to that point, then I think we have missed in many ways what Jesus' whole point about what kind of character he's forming in us is. So whether you think God's involved in your plans for next week or not, I promise you, he is. He is. If you're a believer in Jesus, then what you say matters. It just does. And here's the last thing that I'll say about this. I alluded to it earlier, but Jesus actually lives out this command. He tells us not to swear any oaths. And so you won't find an example of him swearing oaths in the Gospels. And in fact, you'll actually see an example from there in Matthew 26, whenever Jesus is on trial. And I'm going to read verses 62 through 64. And this is what is said there by Matthew. He says, and the high priest stood up and said, have you, Jesus, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? So you don't have an answer for what these guys just said. Verse 63, and Jesus remained silent, and the high priest said to him, pressed him on the matter, and says, I adjure you by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Do you hear what he's saying? Look, guy, I'm telling you, swear on heaven, swear on earth, swear on Jerusalem, swear on your own head. I don't care. I adjure you by the living God. I am calling on you to be honest. And what does Jesus say in verse 64? Jesus said to him, you have said so. But I tell you from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And then the high priest gets up and tears his robes and says, you've heard him utter blasphemy. What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. Here's the point that I want to make. For as much as we may struggle with this and thinking that swearing oaths is difficult or impossible or really, frankly, unnecessary, Jesus didn't seem to think so. And there's a whole lot more going on here at the end of Matthew 26 whenever Jesus is put on trial. I admit there's way more going on than just a matter of swearing an oath. But in the very moment whenever Jesus had that opportunity or was being pressed to do so, he didn't do it. He didn't do it. And what did that get him? It got him crucified. And I'm not at all saying that any time that you fail to swear an oath when someone's trying to force you, and that's going to lead to your execution, that's taking the wrong lesson from this point. But here is what I am trying to say. It cost Jesus a lot to model what perfection would look like. It cost Jesus a lot to show us how we're supposed to live this out. If that is true, then I don't know why we would ever expect this to just be easy. No easier than, hey, your anger is an issue. Hey, your lust is an issue. Hey, no divorce. I don't know why we put this in a separate category than anger or lust or divorce, which is the previous examples that Jesus has given in this same chapter. He has been just as radical there. He is just as radical now. And so I just want to say just real clearly, like, that's the deal. Like, that's just where we are. I don't know why we struggle with this in some areas, but not in others. But I do recognize that we struggle in it. And so as we're pursuing understanding what the Sermon on the Mount is actually teaching us and how we're to live all this stuff out, I understand there's going to be some complications here. I understand it's going to take wisdom. And frankly, I understand that I don't have all the answers. But I am telling you that I think that collectively we can do precisely what the Lord is actually leading us to do. And so what I want to do is I just want to forecast out where we're going this next Wednesday. We're going to be looking at the last two examples. We're going to be looking at retaliation and lex talionis. I'll explain that phrase whenever we get there on Wednesday. And we're going to talk about the love of enemies. That's going to be the two last examples that Jesus gives in this whole section, this whole discourse on the Sermon on the Mount in this very first big section. And it's going to lead to that command for us to be perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. I know that there very well may be some questions. There may be some other dilemmas that you want to work through and just how we apply this in our lives. I want to say, if you have any of those questions, come talk with me. I would love to have those conversations. Pastor JP, Pastor Anthony, it might take all three of us working together to figure this out. But our commitment is to work through pursuing righteousness in God's kingdom. And ultimately, at the end of the day, if you hear nothing else, hear this: oaths are unnecessary for honest people. I love you. I look forward to seeing you again. If you have any questions, come talk with me.